Welcome. I'm Mark Cancian. I'm a senior advisor at CSIS, and I led this project on Baltic security. Welcome to our program today. Let me describe our program. I'll begin with a 10-minute overview of our report, which comes out today, Repel, Don't Expel, Strengthening NATO's Defense and Deterrence in the Baltic States. As most of you are aware, next week the Alliance will hold a summit at Vilnius, Lithuania. They'll be discussing the major challenges to the Alliance. The two major challenges are the war in Ukraine and protecting the eastern members of the Alliance, particularly the Baltic states. After this overview, my colleague Max Bergman will moderate a panel discussing Baltic security in general, and at the end we'll have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions and get some answers. So let's get started. First, I want to note that I'm using a PowerPoint this morning. As a product of the Pentagon, I've lost the ability to speak without PowerPoint, but I find it helpful in conveying complex information, so bear with me. We'll march through the slides quickly, but there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end, and of course, there's more information in the report itself. The project was a quick turn funded by the Lithuanian embassy to look at issues prior to the Vilnius summit. We appreciate their support, but we do note that all of the research, the conclusions, and the recommendations are the product of CSIS alone. And although the insights and recommendations are applicable for Vilnius, these problems are going to be with the Alliance for many years and will apply to summits in the future. I want to note that this was also a team effort. We had, in addition to myself, we had Max Bergman, Dan Fata, Sean Monaghan, Kathleen McGinnis, and our research associate, Meg Kurosawa, who has left CSIS to join the U.S. Navy. So we wish her fair winds and following seas. The report is available now online at CSIS. Noting the change in European security environment as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has become commonplace, but it deserves recognition up front because it drives everything else. There's, of course, been a strong NATO and U.S. response to Russian aggression. For American audiences, we want to note the stakes that are involved here for the Baltic states. Their experience with occupation by the Soviets and the Russians was traumatic, and many Americans don't appreciate the stakes that are involved for these countries. For the United States, of course, the President has made a strong commitment to NATO, calling Article 5 sacrosanct. The United States has moved quickly and quite robustly to help the Ukrainians. But there are distractions. Of course, the pacing challenge for the United States is stated to be China. So there is a focus on the Pacific. In addition, there are budgetary and strategic arguments back in the United States. The report discusses those in some detail. The bottom line, though, is that the Europeans will need to step up and provide much of the support for the Baltic states. There we go. The major threat to the Baltic states, of course, comes from Russia, and Russia's future depends heavily on the outcome of the war in Ukraine, but and one can imagine a variety of outcomes from a partial victory that solidifies Putin's regime to the collapse of the Russian military and the overthrow of Putin. Nevertheless, we see some continuities. Despite the hopes of the West and many of the Russian people, Russia is unlikely to become a liberal democracy and at peace with its neighbors. Instead, Russia will most likely be authoritarian, revanchist, suspicious of the West, and yet still be a major military power. And after the war, Russia will rebuild its military. In fact, it's already taking some steps in that direction. This phrase here, maximum intentions and capabilities, that actually comes from NATO perspective during the Cold War, and it's applicable now. In other words, instead of trying to guess what the Russians might do, NATO needs to be ready for Russian maximum intentions and capabilities. Let me walk through some of the analysis that we did. In the United States, there's some skepticism often about whether the NATO allies are doing enough, and that skepticism is not always misplaced. But it's important to note that NATO is not monolithic. There are differences, and the Baltic states are doing a tremendous amount. All of them are meeting the 2% NATO goal. In fact, they're moving towards 2.5%, and they're even talking about 3% of GDP for their military efforts. And this is an accomplishment that only 7 other NATO states have made. They've also increased their military budgets. Here you can see those budget increases on the chart. Lithuania's military effort has increased 3 times since it became a member of NATO. All the Baltic countries have instituted conscription, and only 4 other NATO countries have done that. As a result, they have a large part of their population in the military, much larger than the United States or Germany, to illustrate, as examples. The problem is that the Baltic states are small, and they just, even though they're making these large budgetary and personnel efforts, they don't have the size to produce a military that is sufficient to defend themselves against a major power like Russia. And to give an illustration of that, even though Lithuania has, as a proportion of its population, 4 times as many people in uniform as Germany, Germany's military budget or military establishment is 32 times the size of Lithuania's, because Germany is just so much larger. The bottom line is that this is all of NATO problem. NATO is going to have to help the Baltic states with security. It's worth noting a few gaps and vulnerabilities. One of them is the distance from NATO's military power. During the Cold War, of course, military forces were stationed mostly in Germany. The distance they had to travel to get to the front lines was relatively short. You can see that on the chart. Today, most of those forces are still in the same garrisons, but now they must travel to the Baltic states up to 10 times as far as during the Cold War. As a result, in addition, the Baltic states lack strategic depth. They're just not very large. As a result, even a short advance by Russian forces, such as they achieved in Ukraine, would be enough to overrun the Baltic capitals. And we note also the particular problems of the Baltic states and Lithuania, that is the Suwalki Gap, and Belarus, which is functioning as an adjunct of Russia. This is potential flashpoint in peacetime and, of course, wartime, because of Russian forces in Kaliningrad and potentially in Belarus. This could be a difficult. They could make it difficult for NATO to reinforce the Baltic states. The map, which may be a little hard to see, shows the rings for Russian missiles and what they could threaten, and of course it covers the entire gap there. want to take a minute to talk about what came out of Madrid and NATO's plans for supporting the Baltic states. At Madrid last year, NATO also committed to a new operating plan. We'll walk through some of those items here. Here we go. It took the step of identifying Russia, as you can see here, as a direct threat. This is really a step back from the founding act back in the 1990s that was much more accommodating and really a recognition of how much the security environment had changed. Of course, invited Sweden and Finland to join, reiterated the investment targets. It established this an effort to expand the existing battle groups that are in the Baltic countries and one in Poland. They run about 1,000, 1,500 troops, to expand those to brigade-sized to enhance forward presence, brigade size being 4,000 to 5,000. Reinforcements and prepositioning of equipment, because prepositioning of equipment can speed deployments, and NATO established this very aggressive target for reinforcements up to 300,000, and then divisional headquarters as the Baltic states desire to build their own divisional headquarters and working with NATO's existing headquarters. We produced a scorecard looking at how NATO is doing compared to the commitments made at Madrid. And I want to start out with, on the positive side, to note that NATO has taken some efforts. Of course, they're bringing in Sweden and Finland. Finland is in. Sweden's application is stuck, but I think there's hope that it will move forward. The operating concept, of course, has been approved, and you can see some of the other items there. The et cetera relates to a variety of important but smaller commitments, for example, on exchanging cyber information. But there are some key items where NATO has work to do. You can see those here. I won't go through all of them. 4 items where they've made some progress. The one that is red there is the expanded reinforcement goals, the high readiness units. The expansion is very robust, very aggressive. The plans for accomplishing that are really not yet in place. So what might be done to close these gaps? Well, we talk about repel, don't expel, and what that means is it's better to repel an attack than to withdraw and have to counterattack and reconquer territory. We're seeing in Ukraine just how difficult that is. Ukrainians have been relatively successful on the defense. They're finding it much harder on the offense. We note in the report that tripwire defenses are highly risky. Reinforcement strategies take time that might not be available. There's also this notion about deterrence by detection, in other words, naming and shaming potential aggressors. That failed in Ukraine. So a forward defense, a deterrence by denial, by far desirable. The first task for Vilnius is, you can see here, basically putting specifics to these initiatives that were launched at Madrid last year. For example, specifying what a brigade is. Decisions need to be made about how large the brigade is, how it relates to the current battle group, where all the constituent parts will come from. Prepositioned equipment, very good at speeding deployments. The United States has prepositioned equipment all around the world, but it's expensive and it needs a lot of planning. Division headquarters are needed with these expanded forces, but how they will operate with NATO, then the national divisions, plus for the national divisions, how they will stand up and gain the equipment and experience that's needed to command at that level. The second task is to set goals for investment. The 2% goal runs out in 2024. It doesn't really run out, but that was the time horizon that was originally envisioned. It will need to be replaced by something else. There's a lot of talk about making that a floor, not a ceiling, maybe setting a target of 2.5%, but there's no question that NATO members need to make the investment, as they used to say in the Pentagon, plans without resources are hallucinations. And finally, there needs to be a process of continually assessing whether these goals are appropriate based on how Russian capabilities evolve. All right, now we're going to try an experiment. And this experiment is something we do extensively in CSIS's executive programs. A key question on the research was how long it would take Russia to reconstitute a military threat to the Baltic states after the war in Ukraine ends. And experts had answers that ranged from 2 years to a generation. So it would be helpful for the literature and the research on Baltic security to get insights from this audience, which has a lot of interest in this subject. I know you may not all be experts, but you're all certainly well informed. That's why you're here joining us this morning. This application is one that CSIS uses extensively, and we've tested it out. We're hoping that it works. So bear with us here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it up. And ask the audience to follow the directions there and put in their input, their guesses. And I'm going to ask our IT, could you just not show the responses quite yet? We'll show those at the end. Is that possible? All right, we'll stay there and not tempt, the IT gods here. Are we getting responses? All right, good. We'll give everyone a minute here. Okay, I'm going to give another 15 seconds here, and then we'll turn it over. But it was very interesting that the bulk of 2/3 of the respondents see this threat emerging within 5 years, and very few looking at the long term. Because when you read experts, some people are talking about a generation, 10 years, 20 years. Maybe even longer. Okay, well, with that, let me turn the floor over to my colleague, Max Bergman. He's going to introduce our panel and then moderate our discussion. So over to you, Max.
Great, thank you, Mark, and thanks for the excellent work on a fantastic report. Encourage the audience to really go check it out and also keep participating in this poll. I think it's really fascinating. I think we'll hopefully revisit it toward the end of the conversation. I'm Max Bergman. I'm the director of the Stewart Center and the Europe-Russia-Eurasia program here at CSIS, and it's my real pleasure to be moderating this panel. Let me quickly introduce our panelists, and then we'll just sort of jump right into a discussion on the report. To my left, we have Rebecca Heinrichs, is a senior fellow and director of the Keystone Defense Initiative at the Hudson Institute, specializing in U.S. national defense policy with a focus on strategic deterrence. Ms. Heinrichs currently serves as a commissioner on the Bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission and also serves on the U.S. Strategic Command Advisory Group and the National Independent Panel on Military Service and Readiness. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. And then to my right is Sean Monaghan, is a visiting fellow with our program here at CSIS on Europe, Russia, and Eurasia, where he focuses on NATO, European security and defense. His career as a civil servant, in the UK Ministry of Defense has focused on international defense policy, including NATO, the European Union, and the United States. In recent years, his work as a policy analyst has seen him contribute to the United Kingdom's integrated review and lead multinational research projects. Sean, thank you so much. I should also mention that Sean is a co-author of the report, so we can grill him on any of the conclusions. And then last, but certainly not least, joining us virtually from a house that looks incredibly cozy, is Michael Ryan, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy. He served 25 years in the U.S. Air Force, flying the A-10 Thunderbolt II in Europe during the Cold War. He served in senior positions at the U.S. mission to NATO, the U.S. mission to the EU, and at U.S. European Command as a member of the Senior Executive Service. Mr. Ryan lectures extensively around the world with a focus on Russian history and world affairs, and is frequently a national security commentator on television. Michael, Rebecca, Sean, thanks so much for joining us. Mark, thanks for a great report. One other plug, I should say that if you're watching this event, you should check out some of our podcasts, the Smart Women, Smart Power podcast, as well as the Eurofile and Russian Roulette podcast that we do here at CSIS, which really cover this content as well. But let's jump into the conversation. Sean, I want to maybe pick up on a point that Mark mentioned, that the Repel, not Expel, I think is a very great slogan and a good mantra for NATO, especially after the events that we saw over the last year, particularly with the Bucha massacre, of what can happen if Russia occupies a foreign country. But what was the strategy beforehand? Since 2014, we have seen Russia enter Ukraine, seize territory. What was the previous strategy that NATO was operating in to defend the Baltics? And what were sort of the deficiencies or challenges that came up with that approach?
Sure. Thank you, Max. Well, in a nutshell, the NATO strategy has changed over the years, particularly since the end of the Cold War, but now is looking quite familiar. NATO has a kind of back to the future strategy, if you like, of forward defense. First, just if I can say thank you to CSIS for having me on this great panel, and thank you for letting me take part in the project, and thanks to Mark for his project leadership. I think, Max, the report is quite timely. I mean, you know, NATO, Baltic security is always important to NATO, but we're a week out from another very important NATO summit in Vilnius, in Lithuania. I note that actually next year would be the 20th anniversary since the Baltic States joined NATO in 2004. Perhaps that would have been a good year to have a NATO summit in the Baltic region, but unfortunately Washington rather trumped them to it, as next year is the 75th anniversary of the founding of NATO, and the summit's coming back to Washington. But the whole of NATO is heading to Vilnius next week. To your point, I think it's an important one. I want to make a couple of points around the point about repel, don't expel, maybe reflecting slightly on the Madrid summit last year and where we've come since then, and then a point on implementation that Mark picked up on in the report. So my first point is that NATO agreed, last year was historic for NATO. The Madrid summit was historic. NATO agreed a new strategy of forward defense, which was basically the strategy that served NATO so well during the Cold War. After the end of the Cold War, NATO saw fit to essentially deprioritize deterrence and collective defense, to move towards a strategy of what it called cooperative security and engagement with Russia and other partners, ex-Soviet Warsaw Pact partners in the region, and eventually integrate most of those into NATO. But its strategy then became focused on expeditionary operations in the 90s and the 2000s. And insofar as deterrence was relevant to NATO's strategy, it was really a model of deterrence by reinforcement. So NATO's still substantial, although less than at the end of the Cold War. NATO's forces would sit at home and essentially be ready to act at a certain notice. And this was actually enshrined in the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, where NATO kind of said, look, our strategy will be based on deterrence by reinforcement and won't involve large-scale forward positioning of NATO forces in Eastern Europe. Kind of fast forward past the expeditionary era operation, and we arrive at Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, and everything changed for NATO. Following that, NATO developed the so-called enhanced forward presence missions and had 4 missions in the 3 Baltic states and in Poland. Still small missions, only battle group up to a kind of 1,000 personnel in size. But these were forward-based missions, so there's a kind of change in the strategy. Fast forward to last year, February 24th, 2022, and kind of all bets are off at that point. And NATO kind of realized that it really had to fundamentally change this deterrence by reinforcement and deterrence by so-called tripwire. These small forces forward would act as a tripwire to deter a Russian invasion, which would trigger a much larger response, conventional and even nuclear, from NATO. NATO kind of realized this wasn't cutting the mustard, so NATO updated its strategy, and this kind of back to the future strategy of forward defense. And the language in NATO's new strategic concept, agreed last year, changed, talked about forward defense, it talked about forward-based combat-ready forces, and rebalancing NATO's forces between reinforcement and being forward-based. The point I'd like to make on this is that actually, although the ambition there from NATO is right, there is a little dissonance between what the strategic concept says and what NATO's strategy is, and the commitments that really allies made in Madrid to implement those changes. What allies agreed to in Madrid was to upscale the enhanced forward presence missions, which, by the way, had doubled from 4 to 8 after the invasion of Ukraine, and to develop essentially more reinforcements by what's called NATO's new force model. So moving NATO's response forces from 40,000 forces to 300,000 forces. This is effectively a 10-fold increase within a month's notice of NATO's ability to quickly reinforce the Baltic States or whatever needs reinforcing. So to me, in a way, although NATO's strategy is now technically one of forward defense, it looks a lot like deterrence by reinforcement with maybe a slightly thicker tripwire. Finally, on the kind of implementation of these commitments, having noted the kind of potential dissonance between the two, despite Mark and I's kind of assessment in the report of implementation being somewhat mixed, of course we couldn't give NATO a totally green scorecard, because that would make for a boring report with no recommendations. A lot has happened in the past year. SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, has been given direct control of 40,000 forces, and he's using those to implement this deterrence policy, the so-called DDA, Defense and Deterrence of the Atlantic Area policy. There's been a whole bunch of exercises. The biggest air exercise that NATO has ever seen, Air Defender, was hosted by Germany a few weeks ago. There have been numerous exercises to prove that the NATO EFP framework nations can deploy brigade-level forces, the UK in Estonia, US in Poland, and so on. But I think there's still a question around the NATO force model. It's such a massive increase in this scale, NATO's scale of reinforcements, a 10-fold increase, The Secretary General, when he announced it, originally wanted to have this implemented by the end of this year. I don't see that happening. We'll see the progress that's announced next week in Vilnius, but I think that's where there's a big question mark for NATO that we'll see next week. Just a final point of introduction. Not forgetting Ukraine here. So Ukraine will be the most important item on the summit next week. The point of all this is that strengthening NATO's defense and deterrence helps Ukraine, because a strong NATO deterrence enables NATO allies to help Ukraine provide military assistance kind of without fear of reprisal. So a strong defense is in NATO's interest, it's in Ukraine's interest too. But I'll leave it there for now.
Rebecca, you were recently in Vilnius, in Lithuania, and I'm curious what, on your visit, and what your perception of the threat is to not just to Lithuania, but to the Baltic states.
Sure, thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation to participate in this discussion. Really well done on the report. And a couple of threads I just want to pull on based on the opening remarks, and then add a couple of things. One, I would just say, there's a lot of congratulations, I think, from many Western capitals that NATO has done such a great job at providing defenses of Ukraine. And I think to some degree, to a great degree, that is true, that it has been quite impressive in terms of the amount of defenses that the alliance has provided Ukraine. However, there is a difference between what some countries have provided versus other countries, and I think that nuance is really important, especially as you think about the Baltic countries. And that's because from even before Russia's most recent invasion, of course, this is a continuation of 2014, whenever Russia invaded and took Crimea, but in February 2022, it was really the Baltic nations that were sticking their neck out quite early on and wanting to provide Ukraine with more advanced weaponry. It was Lithuania that really wanted to deliver the Stinger missiles even before the United States was, and of course it required the United States providing that authorization for Lithuania to provide the Stingers. And then after Lithuania did that, then the United States also delivered our own, and then Germany and others followed. And that's one particular example. If you look at just the amount of aid Lithuania has provided, Estonia, Latvia as well, Poland too, but we're talking about Lithuania here in particular, really, in terms of a percentage of what they had on hand, it was quite a lot. And now they're looking to restock their own defenses. And so I think that's an important distinction that deserves the appropriate degree of appreciation on the part of the alliance. Now, and I think that points to a larger problem that we have to address, which is a difference within the alliance on the assessment of the nature of the Russia threat. And that's where I think this poll is very interesting, and something, of course, we talked about quite a bit in Vilnius and will be again discussed in the forthcoming NATO summit, which is, to what degree does Russia continue to present a very, very serious problem to the alliance, considering how much Ukraine has been successful in degrading Russia's conventional military? There have been American senators here pressing for the military to actually do a reassessment of our military requirements this far into the war, because Ukraine has been so successful at degrading the Russian military, that it perhaps has impacted our actual requirements of which we base what we think we need for that particular problem set, which is quite stunning when you consider how much Ukraine has actually done. And again, that benefits Ukraine, or that benefits, obviously, it benefits Ukraine, it benefits NATO, it benefits the United States of America, to the extent that we can enable Ukraine to successfully degrade the Russian military. And then the last point that I will say too is that there's also a difference, I think, within the alliance that really a deeper point, again, on the nature of the Russia threat, but also on their willingness to actually see Ukraine succeed. Prevail, win, depends on which word you're comfortable using, but it is quite different, I think, than some of the other members of the alliance, which seem to be taking a much more cautious approach and are concerned about horizontal or perhaps vertical escalation. And so they've been more unwilling to provide the kinds of weapons that Ukraine still insists that they need, the DPICMs, the cluster munitions, munitions, the ATACMS, longer range strike systems, bigger drones, et cetera. But Lithuania, the other Baltic nations, and Poland and the UK have been much more aggressive and willing to provide what is necessary to help Ukraine prevail. And I think that's an important point to make. And this gets to what I hope we'll talk about more is then what are the Baltic nations seeing that the rest of the alliance isn't seeing? And then perhaps we can do a better job of listening to them and their threat assessments so that we can actually do what is necessary to provide a more successful deterrence so that we're not dealing with a more serious Russia problem in the years to come.
Thank you. Michael, I want to go to you. You're a longtime NATO watcher. You've seen the alliance over the decades. What has changed in your view over the last year? Is there really been, I think, a transformation in NATO's outlook?
Yes, thanks, Max. It's the perfect question. Thank you for having me, and congratulations to CIS for taking on this project. It's really an important project and, as we said, very timely. Everything has changed at NATO. A friend of mine who worked at NATO for a long time put it this way: NATO is putting the jigsaw puzzle of the Cold War back together. But of course, it's a completely different context. So the question is, how do we do that against an adversary that is completely different? So I'd like to address the question by zooming out a little bit, because strengthening NATO is strengthening NATO in the Baltics. Because an attack on the Baltics is an attack on NATO. NATO as a whole will be engaged. And this is the whole point behind the concept for deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, the SACEUR strategic AOR-wide plan. And also a little noted advance over the summer is the approval of the regional plans. Why is that so important? The thing that made the Cold War NATO work was that every nation knew where their forces had to go, when they had to be there, and what they had to do. That drives defense planning in all the nations. It drives operational level planning, and it allows for leaders to assess the operational risk in the plans and therefore to make timely decisions. So the three things I think which are most important in zooming out to look at the Baltic problem is to focus on NATO decisions, the concept of deterrence, which I'm going to refer to as design defeat, and then tiered and layered defense. And so I take everything that we've talked about already. I think it's all great. It's all moving in the right direction, perhaps not as fast as we'd like. But if we look at what that means for NATO decisions, the first thing that NATO leaders, which means ambassadors, but also heads of state and government, chiefs of defense, and members of the military committee need to do is understand the requirements of the plans, understand the nature of the adversary, and make early decisions to mitigate risk, because we're not going to eliminate risk, and to make small decisions when they need to be made to empower SACEUR and to empower the nations to do the things they need to do on behalf of NATO. Because making these early decisions preserves the North Atlantic Council's decision space, which takes me to my next point, which is on design defeat. We look at deterrence and we think about NATO consensus decision-making. NATO's never going to conduct a preemptive strike. And of course, even though many people knew that Russia was going to attack Ukraine, there was no talk of preempting that attack, and not even deterrent sanctions were employed before before Russia actually attacked Ukraine. And therefore, we have to understand deterrence in the construct of how NATO makes decisions and how NATO as a whole is engaged, because the adversary is undermining NATO's abilities, surreptitiously in many cases, to marshal the forces that we've been talking about. So through hybrid warfare, with which we're all familiar, Russia has been deliberately undermining NATO's ability to make decisions by consensus, undermining NATO's ability to have complete control of its infrastructure, and through many other ways that go beyond the course of this discussion. But therefore, NATO as a whole is engaged prior to the outbreak of any conflict, and NATO decisions have to be taken in a way that defeats the design of the Russian Federation to hamstring NATO's ability to react in the way we're discussing in defense of the Baltics. And so NATO has to make decisions every day to defeat the design of the Russians so that if the Russians do attack, NATO is able has the capability and will and the ability to make those decisions to address those attacks. Because we saw, as has been pointed out, deterrence by denial. Ask the Ukrainians how they feel about that. That doesn't work. Allow the adversary to come in and then repel them on the territory of a NATO nation. It's not good for the NATO nation. And so we don't want to do that. And so we put these decisions together in the context of defeating the adversary's design. And we think about kinetic combat, we like to call it. And we look at how NATO as a whole would be attacked if the Baltics were attacked. And therefore, the defense of NATO in support of the Baltics needs to be tiered and layered. What's a great example? Now that all these nations in NATO have the plan and know where they need to be and when they need to be there, of course, logistics becomes a principal responsibility of the nations and of the NATO force structure and the NATO command structure. But that's going to be the thing that the Russians are going to try to attack in depth. And so we need to strengthen our integrated air and missile defense across the alliance, particularly in the Baltics. And we need to ensure in a layered way that that understanding of the integrated air and missile defense challenge is overlaid against the logistics problem. Because if we're going to have large stocks of pre-positioned equipment, those are very lucrative targets for Russian missile capabilities. And so we need to make sure that our air defenders understand that and take those into account. The routes in which we move forces, and therefore a layer is the resilience layer. When we look at NATO's 7 baseline requirements for resilience, the movement of forces across territory, military mobility, very much in vogue at the European Union, are all part of understanding how NATO as a whole will maintain its ability in the face of a contested environment, whether it be hybrid or direct attack from the Russian Federation, so that we can do the things that we propose to do in the Baltics. And so as we zoom out and look at the Baltic problem, and I've had this discussion with Baltic representatives in my office in the Pentagon at length, they all get it. They're not wrong to say that they need the things that they need, because they do, but those have to be in the context of what NATO as a whole is doing. And I'm very positive at the direction that NATO's moving. There really is a sense of urgency. As I said, it's back to the Cold War, certainly in a different context, but the attitude is very much one of urgency and one of getting after it. We just need to build the muscle memory of making decisions early, making decisions rapidly, and ensuring that we keep consensus moving forward, because NATO without consensus is not NATO. Thanks very much.
No, maybe I could follow up that, Sean sort of mentioned that there's been, really bold commitments with the new force model to go from 40,000 forces that are kind of ready to roll to 300,000. And that progress has not maybe been as rapid as hoped for over the last year. There's also been the case that many Eastern European countries, for instance, have given away whole fleets of their Soviet-era equipment, sort of further depleting themselves, rightly, to support Ukraine. But do you think NATO is sort of in a good position right now to defend every inch of its territory, or does a lot more need to be done in terms of the alliance? Defense spending commitments are going up, but is that enough? Do you feel good about the trajectory that NATO is currently on?
Yes, Max, I feel very good about the trajectory, because as you pointed out, I've been part of NATO for decades. And so when we look at the trajectory and the positive trends, it's definitely climbing rapidly. Just in the 2019 Leaders Summit in London, we were struggling to get the NATO Readiness Initiative across the finish line, which we did, which was a step in the right direction. That was an upward vector on the trajectory, which has even climbed more steeply since. All of these things take time. They start with NATO decisions. The value of NATO is that we talk about these things together every day. And so there really is a shared perspective and a shared understanding. I think the most important thing going forward, and the Baltics are key in driving this, as is Finland, is that turning urgency into real capabilities. And that's what has to be focused upon. And therefore, the Defense Industrial Action Plan that's going to be addressed by heads of state and government in Vilnius, getting defense industry to create the capabilities at speed to invest in the types of things that we need to invest in, is how we're going to accelerate the advancements that the force structure needs.
Rebecca, you wanted to jump in.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say that from the perspective of the Baltic nations, we will really see progress of where NATO needs to go once a lot of these commitments that the Germans have made actually turn into, no kidding, boots on the ground, when we get the brigade in Lithuania as was promised, I think that will be a enormously remarkable and important demonstration of the change that is necessary for the entire alliance, and be curious to hear the others' comments on that, because a lot of these things, there's lots of commitments, especially coming out of Berlin, but then there's been a delay, or in fact we haven't seen some of these things actually turn into reality. That I think would be very, very important. And then the other thing I think would be really important, because there's still some reluctance on the part of some NATO members at the Vilnius summit to actually see a declaration, which is something that the Lithuanians have talked about, different Lithuanian officials, is a public recognition that the Russia-NATO Founding Act has failed, or at least has run its course. And we're now to the point where it's actually becoming an impediment for NATO to make the changes that is necessary. And in order to do that, you have to have clarity of mind, and that would be something that needs to go.
Right. Sean.
Yeah, just to follow on that, great point about, so last week we had the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, in Lithuania committing Germany to provide a permanent brigade of up to 4,000 troops in Lithuania at some point in the future. This was very welcome. I think it took other allies somewhat by surprise, although perhaps it shouldn't have. I mean, Germany just released the week before its first national security strategy, in which it said, made a this commitment to provide the brigade to Lithuania. So it's very welcome. However, at the same time, the 8 EFP framework nations and constituent nations that provide the forces there, they kind of all need to keep on the same page. You can't have one EFP mission growing brigade size and beyond, and the others staying the same or shrinking. So they need to stay on the same page. So it's very welcome commitment from Germany. The other EFP missions there, for what it's worth, presumably the host nations are relatively satisfied with what they're getting from NATO. I think the Estonians are satisfied with those. So that the UK is leading the battle group there, and there was a big exercise, Spring Storm, which demonstrated the UK's ability to deploy a brigade quickly there. I think the Latvians are happy with the Canadian leadership. The Romanians, I think, have some questions for the French, similar questions to the Lithuanians had, i.e. where's the brigade? But as Mike said, the direction of travel here is right. It's moving towards the Madrid commitments. Just one kind of addendum to that is the level of ambition, back to my challenge at the start, is the level of ambition high enough here? How much forces are enough to deter Russia? It's an open question. I don't have the answer. What we do know is that by the end of the Cold War, there were something like 100 NATO divisions deployed throughout Western Europe. Now we have 8 battle groups kind of slowly growing in scale. That's a difference. Now we have a war in Europe, a war in Ukraine, which we didn't have back then. So there's some differences here. The direction of travel is good, but I think there's still an open question, which I don't think anybody has the answer to. Perhaps even Mr. Putin doesn't have the answer to, about how much is enough to deter Moscow.
Right. I think that it's a really good pivot point to focus on the adversary, the threat posed by Russia, and because that is sort of the fundamental challenge to Baltic security. And obviously, the situation in Ukraine has not gone according to Vladimir Putin's plan. We've seen real attrition of the Russian military, and as the poll question that Mark highlighted, how long will it take for Russia to rebuild and really pose a threat, I think is a really important one. On the one hand, you could say, look, Russia has a vast defense industry. While sanctions and export controls are hitting the kind of larger economy, the Russian defense industry will probably find a way, and therefore the Russia's timeline can be very fast. On the other hand, you could say, look, they're being attrited. They may have lost half of their combat power, I think, as the UK Ministry of Defense has highlighted. And with the sanctions and export controls, it's going to take them years, if not decades, or it may be impossible to rebuild. Rebecca, I want sort of your take on what is the future of the Russian threat, and then I'll turn to Michael.
So I think it will be with us. I think it will be with us for some time. And this is the challenge in Washington and across the Atlantic, is to have a proper calibration of the threat and the timeline we're dealing with. I think that from what I've seen, the Ukrainians have done us all a great service, of course, on the back of a great tragedy that we want to get on the other side of on terms that are favorable to the Ukrainians. But if it's 5 years or if we have 10 years, I mean, all that means is that's how much time the alliance has to better build our own ability to deter further aggression. And so it gives us a little bit of a sense of a window, but we should still move with a sense of urgency and purpose. I also am a little concerned when, again, it's sort of a paradox, when you hear elected officials say, look how well Ukrainians have done, therefore Russia is no longer the kind of threat that it was before this, or it was never really that much of a threat. I think that's very, very dangerous. Russia still has, of course, the world's largest arsenal of theater-range nuclear weapons that they've now reportedly deployed to Belarus, obviously a constant problem for the Baltic nations. And so even if those weapons are never employed, they still have an enormous coercive effect on the alliance. And it's something that the alliance has to contend with in a very serious way. So there's a great amount of work to do. And regardless of the timeline, the threat persists and we have to move with a sense of urgency.
Michael, curious for your thoughts on the threat that Russia poses. Has it been diminished because of the war in Ukraine, or is that just giving us sort of maybe a few snow days to sort of prepare and finally turn in do our homework to prepare for when the threat returns?
Well, thank you, Max. I think Russia is an immediate threat to the Baltics today. The nature of that threat may have changed due to the war in Ukraine. But if we think about the order of battle in Russia, the Russian Navy is almost entirely intact. The Russian strategic rocket forces are completely intact. The Russian Air Force is largely intact because it's been unemployed, if you want to use that phrase, in Ukraine. So there's a lot of capability, including the Russian cyber forces, which are not degraded at all based on the operations in Ukraine. Therefore, the nature of the threat to the Baltics has changed. On the plus side for NATO, with the addition of Finland and the end of neutrality in Sweden, that opens up Scandinavian airspace to NATO's greatest comparative advantage, which is its air power. We've not given a single jet to the Ukrainians, not yet anyway. Hopefully we will soon. But with the arrival of the F-35 as well across the theater in Europe, NATO's comparative advantage is still air power. NATO's tactical nuclear weapons, although nobody wants to go in that direction, are mostly air delivered, and that's a significant deterrent to any major attack that the Russians might mount offensively against NATO. So there's a lot still in play, and so we have to not play little kids soccer looking at the land battle in Ukraine and really think about the larger nature of warfare, because Vladimir Putin has set his sights on what he wants. He's made the deterrence calculation and he remains undeterred. And so this fear of horizontal and vertical escalation is real, and the Baltics are right to bring it up. And so land forces do need to be moved there, but we also need to understand, with the addition of Finland, who has the largest artillery force in Europe and can range all of the Baltics from Finnish territory, is a significant deterrent. The ability to operate in the airspace freely across all of Scandinavia is a great NATO capability. And the Baltic Sea is a NATO lake now. And so Russian naval forces are not going to be able to operate in the Baltic at all. And so there's a great preponderance of advantage to NATO in Baltic defense in support of the necessary ground forces that we've been discussing. So I think Russia is a threat. It all depends on what Mr. Putin wants to do and how he wants to do it. But that's going to open a bucket of worms that I don't think he wants to deal with at present, although in the near future he may, depending on how his fortunes turn out in Ukraine.
Sean.
Yeah, Max, for me, this is pretty simple. That there's too much uncertainty not to hedge. So the right strategy here is to hedge. There is uncertainty about the battlefield situation in Ukraine. There is uncertainty about Mr. Putin and his decision-making abilities. Uncertainty about the fragility of his regime. There is uncertainty, as you brought up, about Russia's ability to reconstitute. So interesting seeing the poll. Interested to see the results at the end of this, but it seemed to reflect that nobody really knows the answer. And in a situation of uncertainty, hedging is the best strategy. So NATO has to hedge. And if I was sat in Vilnius or Riga or Tallinn or even Suwałki or Warsaw, I'd be thinking the same thing. At the same time, there's not much uncertainty about a few things that, you know, Mr. Putin, the gloves are off. Russia is a violent revisionist actor. The kind of age of hybrid warfare, in a way, is over. I'll come back to that. We have a conventional war in Europe. You know, the gloves are off. I know last year there was a kind of veiled or not so veiled threat to the Estonian city of Narva made by Mr. Putin. So, you know, those who think that if he were to get into Ukraine and then kind of stop there, I think they'd be sadly mistaken. Even if they weren't, the wise strategy would still be to hedge. Just on the hybrid warfare, hybrid threats point brought up by Mike, something I've looked at, I view the kind of Russia's hybrid threats to NATO allies as the modern Fulda Gap, if you like. It's like Russia's most likely axis of advance, the most likely form of attack. Conventional attack is serious, but hybrid threats are more likely, and that's why it's important that NATO. You know, NATO declared hybrid threats to be part of its Article 5 security guarantee back in 2016 now, and has quite an advanced resilience and cyber defense agenda that I think will move forward at Vilnius. And the EU are important here too. The EU have a lot of tools in the kind of area of resilience, cyber defense, and so forth. So don't forget hybrid threats.
So, well, speaking about hybrid threats, and you know, there was it was a momentous weekend in Russia 2 weeks ago with Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner private military company, or nominally private, but essentially an arm of the Russian state that allows, that essentially enables Russia to do acts around the world with some degree of faux deniability. But Wagner has reportedly been sort of exiled to Belarus. Prigozhin is supposed to be in Belarus. There's still a lot of uncertainty about what happened, about what will happen. But this may propose a new sort of potential hybrid challenge to Lithuanian security with a force that is in Belarus. Lithuania borders Belarus, and as Michael mentioned, with the Baltic now becoming essentially a NATO lake, there is the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, in which the Suvlaki Gap is Lithuanian territory, and that the way Russia would reinforce that is over land. Has the threat dimension to Lithuania suddenly dramatically worsened with both the deployment of nuclear weapons on Belarusian territory, and then also Wagner forces potentially being located there? Rebecca, maybe we'll...
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer seems to be clearly it has. I'm always actually amazed whenever I hear Lithuanian officials talk about the threat environment because they're so calm. but if you look at a map, I mean, they're surrounded, almost entirely surrounded by very serious threats. That they must, it requires an enormous amount of wisdom and preparation to know how to handle these in the gray zone, and I mean information warfare, the cyber attacks, things that you can't necessarily see like you can tanks rolling over their border, that are all very serious threats to the democratic functioning of their country and their physical security. So the answer, I think, is obviously yes, and that's why I think it was a really well said, the point about NATO security is inseparable from the security of the Baltic nations, and that point is, it's hard to overstate how important, or you can't overstate how important that is. So yes, definitely.
Michael, curious for your thoughts on Wagner and what that means now for the Baltics and Lithuania.
Right, thank you. That's an important point, and of course we're still doing the forensics. To me, the most amazing thing about the whole episode was that the Kremlin did not downplay it as a minor skirmish, but actually went high and right, as we say. Putin came out immediately, or almost immediately, and declared the highest level of treason, as did most other senior leaders in the Kremlin. And they left Moscow and they deployed the National Guard. So they panicked, in my view. Now they're trying to recover from that panic. But what does that panic say about Putin's mindset, about the grip that he has on power? And the amount of people who stood by and watched was also very telling. So in this context, clearly they're trying to overtake the Wagner enterprise and actually admit that it is part of the government and take it over. They're trying to minimize Prigozhin as a political force. All of this is classic internal Russian politics. How it's going to play out with respect to the potential for action in the Baltics and the role of Lukashenko remains to be seen. I think it'll pass because Putin needs it to pass because he has other fish to fry in Ukraine and elsewhere. But it does give us a window, particularly when we look at the conclusions of the Vilnius summit and how NATO's senior leadership might reinforce the messages to Putin at this uncertain time within the Russian regime. The nukes in Belarus is a very interesting point. Clearly, Putin's goal is to recreate the Russian Empire, make it look like the Soviet Union did, and he does his interactions with each of his neighbors differently. I mean, Belarus is really almost annexed to the Russian Federation. That's his approach there. Kazakhstan is different. Ukraine is different. Georgia is different. But the end game is all the same. And so as Rebecca said, there's clear and present danger to the Lithuanians, and it is remarkable how calm they are about it. But I think it's, again, a real and present danger. The uncertainty in Putin's mind, but also amongst the oligarchs in the Kremlin, I think is the thing to watch coming out of the events of 2 weeks ago.
Great. Maybe there's a question from the audience, which I think is sort of builds off the hybrid threat question. And that's from John Woodsworth. What complications do the substantial Russian populations in the Baltics, especially in Estonia, Latvia, pose to Baltic security going forward? This has been, I think, a major topic, particularly post-2014, of Russia's potential ability to try to use the Russian-speaking populations that are in a number of the Baltic states as sort of a pretext to justify protecting the Russian population. It's sort of been less talked about, I think, since the full-on invasion, but I think it's still a very good question. Sean, maybe I'll start with you on.
Yeah, sure. Well, the kind of Russian-speaking minority in the Baltic states is if you ever take part in a kind of hybrid war game, it's the playbook. It's the number one play that NATO has to respond to. In reality, I don't think we've seen too much of that. It clearly remains a threat, and as the situation for Russia gets more desperate at home and in Ukraine, then perhaps we're more likely to see them maybe play that card. Perhaps, as the previous question, kind of Wagner-associated people infiltrate their way into the Baltic states and stir up trouble, then we could see something like that. But look, the Baltic societies are used to this. They're very resilient societies. They're very cohesive societies. They have a strong sense of their own identity and a kind of strong sense of integration. So, I think this is one that they've got, under control, but it's an ever-present threat, of course.
I would share that assessment. I asked that question when I was in the region, and it seemed to me, and this is just sort of my own kind of read on the response, that they're obvious. The officials are paying attention to that challenge, and they do have it manageable and under control. It's not something that's that they're as concerned about it as we might think that it could be. I mean, I think one thing to remember though too is the last Soviet forces left Lithuania in 1993. I mean, it really wasn't that long ago, and so it still is in many respects a sort of a fresh problem, and one that they're very keen to handle and to keep an eye on, keep a close watch on. So, real, I think, but not unmanageable.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I could shift gears a little bit, and we can talk about the impact of Finland and Sweden potentially joining the alliance. That Michael, you mentioned that NATO, that the Baltic Sea becoming effectively a NATO lake, and that Finland joining in particular really creates new challenges for Russia, and that when you have Sweden potentially becoming a member as well, that there's now fresh efforts by the Nordic states to cooperate and sort of integrate how their air forces operate. I'm curious, maybe if you could talk a little bit about how significant this is, and then maybe Sean and Rebecca, I'll turn to you all to ask what are the prospects of Sweden getting over the line in the next week or so. But Michael, maybe you could talk about the significance of this first.
Thank you, Max. Finland, with a 1,300-mile border with Russia, is in a position to tie down a significant number of Russian forces in any conflict. So I think that's an important point. Finland also has an extensive inventory of advanced weapons. They have the Joint Air-to-Surface Strike Missile that they can fire off the F-18 and eventually off the F-35 when they get that. And that gives them a range to reach deep into Russian territory to strike advancing echelons behind whatever attack the Russians might conduct in the Baltics. And as I said, they have the largest artillery force in Europe with a range from Helsinki. They can shoot anywhere in Finland. So if you just turn that to the southeast, you can imagine the contributions they can make as a nation. They have 5 million people and a very small army, but they can ramp it up to 350,000 very quickly. And even some estimates say they can go to 800,000. And that's an important contribution if you think about Baltic security coming from Finland. And the Finns, of course, have a total security mindset, so resilience is very much on their minds as a nation, and they're very conditioned to deal with hybrid threats, as are the Swedes. And with the Swedes behind them, and the U.S. Marines coming across Norway, because they have pre-positioned equipment in Norway, as everyone knows, and the Norwegians coming across, presents really a front to the Russians that they won't see anywhere else along the border with NATO. And so it's a complicating factor for Russian strategic planning, and therefore the contribution is significant. Now, the NORDEFCO, the Nordic Defense Cooperation Initiative, is where all of the Scandinavian nations get together quite regularly, and they discuss everything from weapons acquisition to defense industrial cooperation to cooperation on hybrid threats, other aspects of whole of society, whole of government cooperation. So if we want to think about a unified zone within Europe, it's probably the most unified, most cohesive, most aligned set of allies that there is within NATO. And therefore, that is a significant problem if you're a Russian strategic planner.
Now, Sean, what is the prospect of Sweden getting over the line? They're obviously being held by Turkey and President Erdogan. Is there any sort of light at the end of the tunnel here that there'll be movement?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It's a $1 million question. A week out from the summit. Look, the ball is in Erdogan's court. I don't think anybody really knows the answer, apart from Erdogan. We do know that Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, I think was going to host a meeting this week. It might even be today with Turkey, Sweden, and Finland to really try to close with the issue. We're a week out from the summit. In a way, if Sweden didn't join NATO by the summit, it would be a big failure for NATO. On the other hand, as Mike said earlier, NATO is an alliance that's based on consensus. That's almost NATO's unique selling point. And this demonstrates that consensus in action, that NATO respects the views, differing although they are, of all of its 31, hopefully soon to be 32 members, and this is playing out in public, and that's a strength for NATO, not a weakness. But let's hope it gets done by Vilnius. Just another point to back up what Mike was saying on the importance of Finland and Sweden in NATO. I mean, it's fundamental. I went back and looked through NATO's strategic concepts, to look at the kind of deterrence strategy, and there's a report out there if you're interested on that. But right from the very start, right from the first strategic concept, NATO made some assumptions that Finland and Sweden would essentially join in any efforts to defend against Soviet attack. Now they don't have to assume anymore. Now they can make realistic, integrated military plans. Finland and Sweden were kind of the missing piece of Baltic and Northern NATO security in a way, and that's now been amended. I mean, Finland and Sweden were always very close to NATO. They were as close as you could be without being a member. They're also part of the Joint Expeditionary Force, this 10-nation military force in Northern Europe, which is NATO nations. When Sweden joins, will all be NATO nations. So the validity of the JEF comes into question at that point. But it's extremely important, and it's such a massive tectonic shift caused by Russia's invasion. Sweden had 200 years of neutrality, Finland 70, and this is kind of down the drain now. You wonder what, is Switzerland going to join next? But yeah, it's profound.
Well, I have to commend you. I thought that was impressive spin on NATO being operating as consensus, and when really I guess Hungary also hasn't yet ratified Swedish membership. But what I'm hearing is that this is also creating complications for NATO planners, because Sweden isn't in yet, so it can't actually do many of the things that you would want to be doing right now. So bureaucratically, conceptually, it's there. NATO can start taking it into account, but it doesn't have its people sort of at NATO and doing the core tasks that would be, that essentially getting to work and really figuring out the details. But Rebecca, maybe what does it say about Turkey? And NATO has played very nice with Erdogan, I think, over the last year. But if Turkey does not shift its position on a country like Sweden, what does that say about Turkey's membership of the alliance? And then what does that say also about Ukraine's potential membership of the NATO alliance?
Those are all very complex questions with many different ways to answer them. I mean, the challenge, of course, is that as problematic as Turkey can be on issues like this, they're also incredibly vital for NATO in other ways. I mean, it was Turkey that really was the sort of the one that came in and helped negotiate to get some of the wheat exports out of Ukraine when we were really worried about Russia's weaponization of global food supply, and I mean that was to me, I thought we were headed for serious catastrophe that would have second and third order effects in other regions of the world because of Russia's willingness to weaponize wheat and things like that coming out of Ukraine. And so Turkey was was quietly sort of the one that helped negotiate that to allow some of that to leave Ukraine. And so it's sort of one of those the allies that, and I talked to I talked to the Romanians about this. They're always careful to say it would be so much worse if Turkey was out of the alliance and was on the other side of things. And so I think that is a very understandable perspective for those in the region who are worried about the militarization of the Black Sea and then of course the other aspects of the region. So it's a challenge. I was never really all that optimistic that Erdogan would sort of, after the election, then Sweden will easily kind of sail through. And I just, I'm typically sort of the Midwestern optimist, but I was like, I don't know. He's still probably going to try to squeeze out more concessions from the alliance and other things before that would actually happen. And then on the Ukraine question about NATO, I was just talking about this with some other scholars who are looking at this problem, and some who are very eager for the Vilnius summit to make some kind of commitment to Ukraine's eventual NATO membership. I still think that is entirely too premature. I don't think that the NATO alliance is sufficiently bold enough now on insisting that Ukraine win. And I think until Ukraine gets Russia out of its territory and regains its territory, that I think discussions about Ukraine joining NATO are simply premature. And I would be pressing on, again, looking at the Baltic nations and the UK, looking at Poland as leaders on helping the alliance do what is necessary to help Ukraine prevail.
Right. I think one of the, we've sort of left the kind of major elephant in the NATO room toward the end of the conversation. But Michael, I want to get your take on Ukraine membership. I mean, it does strike me that it's not going to happen at this summit, despite I think lots of calls, many from the Baltic States, to create a pathway for Ukraine membership. But in part because there's a war on Ukrainian territory, and a war on Ukrainian territory would mean that if they were members, they would have full right to invoke Article 5 and then bring in the alliance. And I think in some ways, unfortunately, it gives Russia a degree of a veto on Ukraine's future and future path toward NATO membership. But you could argue that they had that veto since 2014, effectively. And so therefore, the whole justification that Russia invaded Ukraine because of its future NATO membership is a blatant lie and totally ridiculous. But anyway, that's my take. But I'm curious for your take on what we'll see when it comes to Ukraine at Vilnius.
Thank you, Max. I agree with what Rebecca said, so let me say that right at the outset. But also, as I mentioned, things in NATO take time. Things build over years because it's a process of developing a shared understanding, a shared perspective, and then putting building blocks in place at the rate at which you can achieve consensus on each one of those building blocks. What I would expect to see, what I hope to see, that doesn't mean it's going to happen, but what I'd hope to see is an acceleration of the mechanisms to transform the Ukrainian military into a NATO military. In other words, to deepen the level of planning cooperation, to deepen the industrial defense cooperation so that we can start to transform the Ukrainian defense industry into a more Western, more modern defense industry so that they're able to produce the types of NATO interoperable equipment they will need on the day that they do become members after they are victorious in the war. Again, we're at Mike Ryan's hope level here. And so I would look for things that really look like a membership action plan, but aren't called a membership action plan, although a map for Ukraine would be a great step. But whatever we call it, it needs to be concerted effort to enmesh Ukraine, enmesh the Ukrainian military and NATO military structures to make it more interoperable and more standard with NATO, to really solve the problems of this piecemeal approach we've been using to support the Ukrainians. For example, 14 different types of 155 millimeter ammunition that work in different guns. I mean, that sort of a problem that we've created for the Ukrainians has to go away. And so we really need to streamline, to reinforce, to commit through bureaucratic connections, through operational connections, so that on the day when we can send NATO troops into Ukraine in peacetime, to further strengthen the bonds between allies and Ukraine, we're in a position to do that. As I said, all these things are built over time, one block of consensus at a time. And I think if we can make rapid progress down the road of really cementing Ukraine into NATO without calling it that, then we'll be able to declare success at Vilnius.
Sean, there's been talk of the U.S. making sort of Israel-style commitments to Ukraine in terms of providing regular annual funding, and not just the United States, but also other countries like the UK, France, Germany, providing sort of long-term money for Ukraine that they can bank on, make long-term acquisitions, and therefore strengthen their military, not just be focused on the current counteroffensive, but on building their military in 2025, 2026. Where is that, and what do you see happening with Ukraine at Vilnius?
Sure. Well, Mike and Rebecca have covered a lot of the ground here, so thank them for that. But I think, Max, although the headlines will be about Ukraine NATO membership or not, as the case may be, and I think all parties have kind of admitted that it's not going to happen until the war ends, and President Zelensky himself has said that. Actually, the most important kind of elements next week for Ukraine will be outside of NATO structures. So you mentioned the possibility of security guarantees or security assurances, and those are under discussion. They have been for a while. There's been various proposals from the kind of the kind of big three European nations, Germany, France, and the UK and US, to lock in a kind of long-term provision of support to Ukraine. So all allies have said we will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, but Kyiv wants to know what does that look like? How long for? How much money? What types of systems? These are our requirements. Let's have a conversation along the kind of lines. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's okay, as you mentioned, the US support to Israel. So Ukraine wants some certainty and security assurances that provide long-term assistance on a concrete basis will provide some of that. Most of the assistance that's gone to Ukraine has been outside of NATO structures also, so the US-led Ukraine Defense Contact Group has been central to the provision of the billions and billions of dollars of support that's gone to Ukraine. So we might expect a meeting of those nations and some more agreement of deliverables. NATO itself is likely to kind of hedge on the language. I expect an agreement that the kind of Bucharest language still applies, that Ukraine will become a member of NATO in the future. And then, as Mike suggested, perhaps some more concrete or practical actions on top of that to demonstrate progress. So I think the Ukraine NATO Commission will be upgraded to a council, and perhaps that will meet in Vilnius. Perhaps there will be an agreement, as Mike suggested, to remove the MAP requirement to Ukraine. Although, as other members, Ukraine will still have to meet the criteria. NATO still has to do its due diligence about admitting a new member. So there might be some practical steps beyond the Bucharest language, but I don't think allies are agreed on exactly what the next steps are. But as I said, a lot of the important stuff will be done and agreed outside of NATO structures. And of course, NATO's deterrence, as I said earlier, is really important here. NATO needs to strengthen its own deterrence, which is really what our report is about, although focused on the Baltic region. And strengthening NATO's deterrence helps Ukraine too.
Great. Well, we have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to go to some of the questions from the audience. We'll do sort of, I think, more rapid fire. And if folks online want to fill out the poll, and then we'll at the end, we'll assess the results. And then maybe I'll ask each of you to actually give your prediction on how fast it will take Russia to reconstitute, and then we can see where we land. There's a question from the audience about defense spending, that it's important that the question is that raising defense spending is one concern, but what is necessary to ensure the right policies and procedures are implemented to make sure we get maximize the use of those resources, right? I mean, there is a concern that you're going to see European countries spending money and they're all going to then go in different directions, so we won't have the same kind of impact if this effort was more coordinated. Rebecca, maybe start with you, and then turn to Mike and Sean.
So one, I think that defense spending is an interesting thermometer that tells us how serious these countries are at committing to their own security, their own defense. But it's not the whole story, and so what they're spending their money on is matters a great deal. This is sort of my constantly poking the American government on looking just at how much money the United States has contributed to Ukraine's war effort. I say, yes, but the categories of weapons matter a great deal. And so if you could let me decide how to spend that money, it might look a little bit differently. And so I think that that's just a really important, it matters on what we're spending on, and there's certain things that we will get a bigger bang for our buck, quite literally in some sense, and that we want to spend our money on, and then also cannot make this point more strongly enough, is that this really must be a wake-up call for the entire alliance on defense industrial base. We have got to be able to produce the necessary weapons at the scale and speed we need if we're going to have these countries that have incredible manufacturing industrial capacity redrawing borders through aggression. And I wanted to see how long we'd go before someone mentioned China. Here we are, 10:52. Another big problem here that we haven't addressed yet is to the extent that China will continue to back Russia's effort in a variety of ways, short of huge numbers. I know that they're already providing component parts to the Russia war effort, but this is a big wake-up call for the alliance and also for the United States to get ready to deter other, areas, Chinese aggression, of course, in the Pacific theater as well.
Great. Mike, let's go to you. And then I think you bringing up China is a great point, and we'll turn to that. There's another question from the audience about that. But Mike, maybe on the defense spending.
Thank you, Max. What we buy and how we buy it is broken. We buy kit because it looks great on the ramp and everybody wants to get their picture taken in front of it, but that's not necessarily what we need. NATO and the NATO Defense Industrial Action Plan is starting with aggregating demand. What is the overall demand? Not just for kit, but as I mentioned, a layered defense, which includes logistics distribution, all the things we need to be credible in our deterrence and to be capable of going to war if we need to do that. And so that aggregated demand for a layered defense strategy is incredible. I want to piggyback on what Rebecca said about the defense industrial base. We need to get away from a European defense industrial base discussion and have a transatlantic defense industrial base discussion, because Europe simply can't build the capabilities that it needs at a price it can afford because the market's just not big enough and there's too many producers. So industry already works across the Atlantic. We need to empower them to work better across the Atlantic and really focus on a transatlantic defense industrial base that can give us what we need at scope and scale and at cost. Because how much we're going to spend is going to be controlled by other factors that we really have no control over, like inflation. And so we really need to focus on buying the right things, not just buying stuff.
Yeah, on defense spending, defense investment, again, I can't believe it's taken this long. There's a lot of important things on the agenda next week at Vilnius. This might even be, in the long term, the most important, because without sufficient defense investment, there is no defense. And big picture since the end of the Cold War, I mean, during the Cold War, Europe spent on average about 6% GDP on defense. US spent more. Since the Cold War, it's been around 1.3, 1.5, something like that. Defense spending needs to rise. It has risen in Europe since 2014 by about a third. Actually, if you look at US defense spending, the US spends a terrific amount on defense. but it's also in decline. It was 3.8% a few years ago. It's now 3.1%. I think US congressional budget obviously is looking at 2.8% by the end of the decade. I mean, that's something that needs to be looked at too. So defence investment is important. Of course, the Allies signed a pledge in 2014 at the Wales summit to meet 2%. Only 7 of them do. The pledge runs out next year, 2024. By then, apparently, up to 20 of them will meet that. I'm not sure I see that happening. So 2 things. The alliance needs a new pledge. 2% has to be a floor. What's the next target? I don't know. The Balts are spending 3%. Poland's spending 4%. Point 2, most allies don't meet the current target. So there needs to be more pressure and mechanisms, incentives perhaps. NATO has some common funding. There's innovation fund to incentivize nations to spend more, spend differently. The EU is quite good at this. It has incentive schemes for nations to cooperate, the European Defence Fund, PESCO, and so on. I think more creativity will be required to get allies to spend more on defence and spend on the right things as well.
Yeah, we just to do a plug for another report, a report out at CSIS on transforming European defense, looking at the focus on integration and the need for greater cooperation amongst European countries when it comes to defense procurement, so that Europeans increasingly are operating, same platforms and coordinating their spending a bit more. We have just a few minutes left. I want to do a lightning round on the kind of question of the day of how long do each of you think it will take Russia to reconstitute? We've talked about it a bit, but not to put everyone on a spot, but that's the poll question. So Sean, maybe I'll start.
Sure.
We'll start with you.
Well, I'm going to start by dodging the question, Max, because look, it's fundamentally uncertain. I'm not just going to pick a number out of thin air, but this is a useful kind of fact in itself. So we can do a couple of things. We can reduce the uncertainty. I think more attention needs to be paid. You've written about, Russian defense industry. There are some kind of combat indicators that suggest how long it might take and what the political will for Moscow to reconstitute. Look at mobilization, that kind of thing, demographics. All of that we need to pay more attention to. And second is, we have agency here. A strategy of deterrence works because it dissuades the adversary from, aggression. So back to this kind of hedging strategy, meeting the Madrid commitments, and no matter how uncertain the threat is, if we do our utmost to deter it from happening in the first place, we can kind of shape the future. We're not kind of passive actors here.
It's a useful dodge, but I. Mike, over to you. Are you going to dodge the question as well, or what's your take on how long it will take for Russia to rebuild? We'll come back to you, Mike. We're having a short issue with your audio, but Rebecca, are you back?
I'm back.
Okay.
So I put my note down on the button. I said I'm out of government and occasionally retired, so I'll address the question directly. As I said, Russia is a threat to the Baltics today, has the capability to attack the Baltics today. What we need to do on our side is avoid a failure of imagination. We have to look at what Russia could do with what they have and then prepare for that outcome. As I mentioned, President Putin's state of mind is in question after the Wagner incident. And if he feels that his dream of reconstituting the Russian Empire is slipping away, he may become even less predictable than he is now. And therefore, we need to be prepared for these scenarios, again, that we might not want to imagine today, but we must imagine, because President Putin has made it very clear what his agenda is. The Baltics, who understand the Russians much better than we do, have been telling us for years what his agenda is, and he seems to be on path to achieve, or at least to pursue, those objectives. And therefore, we need to be ready, and we need to be ready today. And that requires imagination from all of us and a real commitment to doing the things that need to be done.
Indeed. Rebecca.
Yeah, if I may, I've got this great line from your report. And so it kind of gets at this, I think is really important. It says, in making a judgment about Russian reconstitution, NATO needs to avoid mere imaging. Putin has shown that he has been willing to take risks that most NATO nations would regard as imprudent. That should be the lesson of this war, and I think applied not just in this particular context, but also the bigger context, which is that I do believe that that China is the #1 problem, but you cannot look at it without looking at the Russia problem, because China is Russia's biggest supporter of Russia's efforts in Ukraine. And a lot of the question about Russian reconstitution is going to depend on what China decides to do. And then my last little point I would just say is on this question of China, which some of our NATO allies are still more kind of uncomfortable kind of talking about. They're willing to say that there was a mistake on energy independence on Russia, Nord Stream 2, et cetera. But they risk kind of jumping out of this particular boiling pot into another one, which is China and investments in China. Lithuania, once again, is leading the way even on the China question. And so they have been very, very forward-leaning and courageous on making sure that they don't have too much reliance on China and are instead investing in Taiwan, which is another great lesson, I think, for all of the NATO members.
Great. I want to thank all of you for an excellent discussion. Well, then let me just see, before we thank our guests, if we can pop the poll back on the screen, given it's going to happen momentarily, to see where the results come in. Here we go. So five, yeah, I did get a number from any, our panelists were just rejected the moderator's question. I think if I was going to put a number on it, I would say probably 5 to 10 years. And I would go with the plurality here. 41% says 5 to 10 years, 27% 2 to 5 years, 27% says less than 2 years, and 5% say more than 10 years. I think regardless of I think the results here demonstrate that Russia will remain a threat, particularly under the current leadership. And I think one of the things that when we think about reconstitution of the Russian military, just to agree with all my panelists here, is that it may not rebuild the same way. And so it may find other ways to rebuild its forces, to find a way to challenge and threaten NATO, because I think one thing is clear, is that Vladimir Putin sees Russia as an adversary of the West, adversary of the United States, and will seek to remain a real threat and challenge, because he wants us to take him incredibly seriously, and I think that means we have to. But with that, I want to thank everyone so much for joining us. I want to thank Mike for being here virtually, Rebecca coming in person, and Sean works here, so thanks for coming downstairs. But let me join me in thanking all our panelists, and also thank Mark Cancian for the great work, and Kathleen McGinnis and Alex Day and everyone else for organizing this panel. So thank you.